Thank you, thank you, thank you. I hardly recognize myself. I think I must be a hyperactive person. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thanks to everyone who's here. When I look out in the audience and I see so many of my favorite people here in one room, it feels like a family reunion more than it does an event here at the school. But I couldn't feel more at home anywhere than at the Clinton School of Public Service, because when I was about 8 years old, I committed myself to public service and to politics in Arkansas. And as Angie mentioned, I was very, very proud of Arkansas and all of our high-achieving people. And I've always believed in Arkansas exceptionalism with an exclamation point. And you presented a lot of facts that we can prove that. So, you know, and I was thinking, because many of you heard my discussion yesterday at Political Animals Club. Some of you heard me at the Christmas party at the Wilbur Mills Treatment Center, and then some of you have just had long conversations with me throughout my whole life and yours. So I thought I'd take a different tack tonight, because we do have some students here, and so I wanted to talk a little bit in the form of my old full-time profession of being a professor and a historian. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is that when I was a student and a professor of political history, I often read the writings of George Mason. Ironically, I live where he lived now, there in Virginia, in Fairfax County. He was one of the founding fathers at the Philadelphia Convention. So in 1789, he wrote about the U.S. House of Representatives. And he said it's the closest thing we have in the U.S. to being a repository of our democratic principles. And so he said, a member of the House of Representatives, unlike, you know, members of the Senate, for example, should be very close to their constituents. They should think as they think, they should feel as they feel, and they should be residents among them. And Mr. Mills took this very seriously and never bought a home in Washington, and was always here when Congress was not in session. And then when I was a professor and teaching the brilliant Skip Rutherford what I knew about the Constitution, we looked, and Article 1 of the Constitution is the legislative article. It sets out the powers of Congress. And it says that Congress has the premier power in the country. And then when the first Congress in 1789 created the first committee, they created the Ways and Means Committee. And so it was from the start an interesting position to be in, because it dealt with all the tax and trade and financial issues, interstate highways, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all the things like debt ceilings and national debt versus annual deficit and that kind of thing. So when Mr. Mills was elected to Congress, it was in a period when presidential power was at its peak, because Franklin Roosevelt was president. But the peak of presidential power was when Abraham Lincoln was president. And I hope if you haven't had a chance to see the movie Lincoln that you will, because I think it's quite inspiring. After Lincoln was assassinated, Congress became very, very powerful. And Woodrow Wilson was a professor of political science at that time. And it was before he became president of Princeton and governor of New Jersey and then president. And he wrote a book called Congressional Government. And he called the committees and the committee chairmen Lord Proprietors. So ironically, when he became president and TR was president and FDR was president, it was the president that was so powerful. So he got to rewrite his book, I guess, in his head at least. Mr. Mills was elected in 1938 to Congress at the peak of presidential power. And he had so many interesting stories about President Roosevelt. One was he went down to talk to Roosevelt, and actually Roosevelt had asked his chairman to come down. He was first on banking committee because his father owned Bank of Kensett, and he had done a lot of work there. And so President Roosevelt was asking his chairman of his committee how his legislation was going to fare, and the chairman said, "Oh, it's going to pass, Mr. President." And then he said, looked at Mr. Mills, he was trying to remember his name, and he said, "What do you think?" And Mr. Mills said, "Oh, Mr. President, I don't think it's going to pass." And he just threw a fit. He said, "My goodness, did those constituents in Arkansas send you up here to be so negative?" He said, "No, they sent me up here to tell you the truth, Mr. President, and it's not going to pass." And he said it failed, and President Roosevelt called him back down there and said, "Well, I want to be speaking to you more often so I can find out what's really going on." But after Roosevelt passed away, Legislative Reform Act was passed in 1946, and it gave power, a lot of power to Congress. Well, by 1946, Mr. Mills was really a rising star in Congress, and he was viewed as a future chairman of Ways and Means, and he was viewed as a future Speaker of the House. And he was a constant companion with Sam Rayburn. And Robert Doughton of North Carolina was chairman of Ways and Means. And Mr. Doughton was 40 years older than Mr. Mills at that time, so you could see there was quite a change in Congress coming on. Mr. Doughton was very hard of hearing, and he didn't wear hearing aids. He used a horn to hear. And Mr. Mills said you could always tell when the chairman was bored, he'd put down the horn. And he didn't have a very good relationship with Sam Rayburn. So from the time Mr. Mills went on the committee, he was the one who was doing the committee research, and he was the one that was carrying messages from the chairman to the speaker and vice versa. And so this went on, proceeded. Mr. Doughton left Congress, and a couple of other people died and left Congress. And in 1958, Mr. Mills became the youngest person ever to be chairman of Ways and Means. And he ended up serving longer than anyone else had ever served as a member of the committee. So 1971 comes along, and his power is at its height. And that's when I met him, because in 1971, when I was teaching Skip, or he was teaching me, maybe a little of both, University of Arkansas Department of Political Science went to Washington to establish internships in the offices of our members of the delegation. And so we met all of the members of the delegation. We were very proud of them. So I had studied Congress a lot at that point as a student and as a teacher. And and I read everything I could find in newspapers, magazines, radio broadcasts, television broadcasts about the Arkansas congressional delegation. I was proud of them. I think we all were. And Dr. Richard Finno was a professor of political science, and he was basically the icon for congressional research. And he called on political scientists to not just write about theory and not just write about philosophy or not just systems analysis, but to write about, on the basis of participation and observation, actual members of Congress. And he was a big advocate of writing about members of the House of Representatives because he thought they were closer to the people. And he said they're widely discussed, they're narrowly understood, they're lead subjects in newspapers, but it's just short sound bites. It's not in-depth analysis. And he said they're very rarely ever the subject of any kind of political science, and almost never of close, actual, realistic observation. So I made a mental note to myself, but I never expected to know a member of Congress well enough to do that kind of research or insight. And so then once I did, many other people were considering writing books, and many other people interviewed Mr. Mills at length and started